My daughter called me pathetic at her wedding, and I just smiled because she had no idea about the $35 million fortune I'd built, the kind of wealth that could change everything for her in an instant. But as I stood there, absorbing that word like a punch to the chest, I knew the money wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the truth about to unfold on a day she'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation had arrived in a thick cream envelope, the kind that costs more than it should, with my name written in elegant calligraphy that someone else had certainly been paid to do. Mr. Thomas Reynolds. Not Dad, or even father of the bride, just my name, formal and distant, like I was merely another guest at my own daughter's wedding. I placed it on my kitchen table, next to my untouched coffee. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of the home I'd lived in for 30 years. It was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing that would suggest the fortune I'd quietly amassed over decades of strategic investments and business decisions. As I opened the invitation, I half hoped to find a handwritten note from Vanessa, something warm and personal. Instead, there was only the formal invitation card and a small note about the registry at high-end stores I'd never shop at. No request for me to walk her down the aisle, no mention of a father-daughter dance, nothing that acknowledged our relationship beyond my genetic contribution to her existence. I sighed and set the invitation aside, my fingers lingering on the expensive paper. Vanessa had always been embarrassed by me, by my simple clothes, my unpretentious car, my ordinary job as a maintenance supervisor at the local factory. What she didn't know, what I had deliberately kept from her and her mother when we divorced 15 years ago, was that the ordinary job was at my own company. A company I had built from nothing into an industrial empire worth millions. The factory was just one small part of Reynolds Industrial Solutions, a corporation that had expanded across 3 continents. I drove the same 10-year-old pickup truck, wore the same brand of work shirts I'd always worn, and lived in the same modest house where Vanessa had grown up. Not out of necessity, but out of choice, because I believed that wealth shouldn't change who you are at your core. I picked up my phone and looked at the last text exchange between Vanessa and me. It had been 3 months ago, her telling me about the engagement to Bradley, a financial analyst from a good family, as she put it. I had congratulated her and asked if I could meet him. She had replied with a vague, maybe sometime, that never materialized into an actual meeting. The truth was, Vanessa had been slowly pushing me out of her life since the divorce. She'd chosen to live with her mother, Claire, who had embraced the settlement money I'd provided and moved them to an upscale neighborhood across town. Claire had married quickly, a lawyer with social connections, and together they had cultivated in Vanessa a taste for status and appearances that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. I hadn't fought it. Perhaps that was my mistake. I had always believed that values speak louder than words, that my daughter would eventually see through the superficial trappings of wealth to what really mattered. I had hoped that my example of hard work, integrity, and humility would be enough. Clearly it hadn't been. Outside, the neighborhood was coming to life. Mr. Peterson was walking his old retriever past my house. He waved and I waved back. These were my people. Honest, hard-working folks who judged a person by their character, not their bank balance. This was the world I had chosen, even when I could have afforded mansions and luxury cars and all the trappings of visible success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat down at my computer. With a few clicks, I accessed my private banking portal, a high-security interface that required multiple authentications. The numbers that appeared on the screen would have shocked anyone who knew me as just the maintenance guy. $35 million in liquid assets, another 40 in business holdings and real estate. A philanthropic foundation with an endowment of $15 million that anonymously funded scholarships and community projects throughout the region. I had never shown this to Vanessa, Not when she was struggling to pay for the exclusive private university she'd insisted on attending. Not when she'd complained about having to work part-time jobs while her friends shopped and traveled. Not when she'd moved into a tiny apartment after graduation because the entry-level position at her prestigious marketing firm barely covered the rent. Part of me had always wanted to reveal everything, to see the look on her face when she realized her embarrassing father could have bought her everything she ever wanted 100 times over. But another part, the wiser part perhaps, knew that would have been the wrong lesson. Money easily given is rarely valued. Character isn't built on handouts. I closed the banking portal and picked up the invitation again. The wedding was in 3 weeks at the Grand Horizon, one of the most exclusive venues in the city. I knew it well, not because I had ever attended an event there, but because I owned the property management company that had recently acquired it. Another fact Vanessa didn't know. My phone rang, breaking the morning silence. It was Michael, my financial advisor, and one of the few people who knew the full extent of my wealth. "Morning, Tom. Just checking if you've made a decision about the Westlake development project. The investors are waiting for your final word." I glanced at Vanessa's invitation before answering. "I'm leaning toward a yes, but I want to review the environmental impact assessment one more time. Can you send that over?" "Already in your secure email," Michael replied. "Also, the foundation board needs your input on the new scholarship criteria. And how are you doing with the wedding coming up?" Michael knew about my complicated relationship with Vanessa. He was not just my advisor, but one of my oldest friends. "I'm going," I said simply. "She doesn't want me to walk her down the aisle. Claire's husband is doing that, but I'll be there." As the invisible billionaire, Michael's tone was gentle but questioning. We'd had this conversation before. "As her father," I corrected. "The money doesn't define me, Mike. You know that." "I know," he sighed, "but sometimes I wonder if keeping her in the dark all these years was the right call. She's an adult now. Maybe it's time." I stared out the window, watching a young couple with a stroller pass by my house. "Maybe after the wedding," I conceded. "Let her have her day without complications." After hanging up, I walked through my modest home, touching the familiar walls, the simple furniture that had served me well for decades. My wealth had never been about luxury or status. It had been about security, independence, and the freedom to make choices based on values rather than necessity. I had hoped to pass those values to my daughter, not just the money. In my home office, I opened the safe, hidden behind a family portrait, Vanessa at her high school graduation, one of the last times she had genuinely smiled in my presence. Inside the safe was a thick folder containing my will and estate plans. Everything was meticulously organized, with Vanessa as the primary beneficiary. Despite our strained relationship, I had never considered cutting her out. She was my only child, my legacy. But there were conditions. The inheritance wasn't a simple lump sum. There were trusts, foundations, charitable commitments that would require her engagement and understanding. I had structured it to be a responsibility as much as a gift. Would she be ready for that? Had I prepared her at all? The following Saturday, I found myself at Davidson & Sons, the city's most prestigious men's clothier. It wasn't my usual shop. I typically bought my clothes from department stores or online. But the wedding called for something appropriate. I didn't want to embarrass Vanessa further by showing up in one of my old suits. "Something classic," I told the sales associate, a young man named Ethan who had clearly assessed my net worth based on my appearance and found it wanting, "for a wedding." "Of course, sir," he replied with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask his skepticism. "May I ask, what's your budget range?" Before I could answer, a voice called out from across the store. "Tom! Tom Reynolds, is that you?"
I turned to see Richard Kensington approaching, impeccably dressed as always. Richard was the CEO of a regional bank and sat on several corporate boards with me, though few people knew of my involvement, as I often used proxies at public meetings. "Richard," I nodded with a smile. "Good to see you." "Likewise." He clapped me on the shoulder, much to Ethan's visible surprise. "Are they taking good care of you here? I've been coming to Davidson's for 20 years. Just getting started, I replied. Richard turned to the increasingly confused sales associate. Whatever this man wants, put it on my account. Tom here is one of the sharpest business minds in the country, though you'd never know it to look at him. He laughed. That's not necessary, Richard, I protested. Nonsense. Consider it a thank you for that tip about the Asian markets last quarter. Made me a small fortune, he winked. Now, what's the occasion? My daughter's wedding, I said, feeling a complicated mix of pride and sadness. Ah, Vanessa, how wonderful. Where's the celebration? The Grand Horizon. Richard whistled. Fancy. Well, we need to make sure you look the part then, don't we? He turned to Ethan, whose entire demeanor had transformed. Bring out the new Italian collection and the Swiss timepieces. Really, Richard, I began. Tom, he cut me off gently. I know your whole modest millionaire philosophy, and I respect it. But this is your daughter's wedding. The one day it's not about the principal, but about her. Let yourself be the successful father you are, just for one day. His words hit home in a way I hadn't expected. Had my principles become a form of stubbornness? Was I making this about me rather than Vanessa? 2 hours later, I left Davidson & Sons with a handcrafted Italian suit, a silk tie, and leather shoes that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I declined the watch Richard tried to insist on. I would wear my father's old Timex, as always. But I had to admit, the suit made me look like the successful businessman I actually was, rather than the working-class facade I'd maintained for so long. As I drove home in my practical pickup truck, I found myself thinking about the coming wedding in a new light. Perhaps Richard was right. Perhaps for one day, I could set aside my convictions about living simply and allow myself to be seen as successful, not to show off, but to honor Vanessa's special day. To fit into her world, rather than expecting her to embrace mine. The week of the wedding arrived with a flurry of last-minute preparations, none of which involved me. Claire had made it clear through terse text messages that everything was under control and my only responsibility was to show up on time and try to blend in with the other guests. The subtle dig wasn't lost on me, but I let it go. This wasn't about Claire or me, it was about Vanessa. The evening before the wedding, I sat alone on my back porch, nursing a glass of whiskey, not the expensive kind that filled my company's executive bar, but the affordable brand I'd always preferred. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. I found myself thinking about my own father, who had died before I made my fortune, but who had taught me everything I knew about the value of hard work and integrity. I hope I did right by her, Dad, I whispered to the stars, even if she doesn't see it that way. My phone buzzed with a text. To my surprise, it was from Vanessa. Rehearsal dinner went well. See you tomorrow, 2 p.m. sharp. No, love you, or even good night. Just information, as if texting a casual acquaintance. Still, it was more communication than I'd had from her in weeks, and I chose to see it as positive. Looking forward to it. So proud of you, sweetheart. Love, Dad. She didn't respond, but I hadn't expected her to. I finished my whiskey and went inside to prepare for the day that would change everything, though not in the way any of us anticipated. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. I woke early, as was my habit, and went through my normal routine: coffee, newspaper, a walk around the neighborhood. Neighbors waved and called out greetings, unaware that today was anything special. I liked that about my life here, the normalcy, the lack of pretense. At noon, I showered and carefully dressed in my new suit. I had to admit, looking in the mirror, that I barely recognized myself. The suit fit perfectly, highlighting my still-fit physique rather than hiding it like my usual work clothes. I looked prosperous, successful, like the multi-millionaire I actually was. For a moment, I considered changing back into one of my old suits. This felt like a deception somehow, a betrayal of my principles. But then I remembered Richard's words about this day being for Vanessa, not for me. so I straightened my tie, polished my father's old watch, and prepared to step into a role I had avoided for decades, that of Thomas Reynolds, industrial magnate, and one of the wealthiest men in the state. What I didn't know then was how much that role would be tested before the day was through. The Grand Horizon lived up to its name, a magnificent glass and stone structure perched on the edge of the city with sweeping views of the skyline. As I pulled into the parking area in my old pickup truck, I couldn't help but notice the line of luxury vehicles, Bentleys, Mercedes, even a few Ferraris. For a moment, I felt a twinge of self-consciousness before reminding myself that I could have bought the entire fleet with what was in my checking account. The valet approached, trying to hide his surprise at the contrast between my elegant suit and modest vehicle. "For the Wellington Reynolds wedding, sir?" he asked, handing me a ticket. "Yes," I replied, slipping him a $100 bill. His eyes widened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Thank you, sir. The ceremony is in the Crystal Ballroom, 3rd floor." Inside, the venue was transformed into a wonderland of white roses and crystal. Soft, ambient lighting created an atmosphere of ethereal elegance. Guests in formal wear mingled in small groups, champagne flutes in hand, voices kept at a polite murmur that echoed off the marble floors. I recognized some faces: business associates who had no idea I was attending as the father of the bride, old family friends who had drifted to Claire's side after the divorce, and what appeared to be Bradley's family, distinguished by their confident posture and quiet authority. "Mr. Reynolds?" I turned to see a young woman with a tablet and an earpiece, clearly part of the wedding coordination team. "Yes, that's me. We have you seated in Section C, Row 5. She gestured toward the ceremony space. "Not with the immediate family, as per the bride's request." The statement was delivered without malice, just professional efficiency, but it stung nonetheless. Row 5. Not even close to the front. I was being seated with distant relatives and casual acquaintances. "I see," I nodded, maintaining my composure. "Thank you." As I made my way to my assigned seat, I noticed Claire across the room, resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Beside her stood Gerald, looking every bit the successful attorney in a tailored tuxedo. They were surrounded by a circle of admiring guests, Claire laughing at something someone said, her hand resting casually on Gerald's arm. Our eyes met briefly across the room. Claire's smile faltered for just a moment before she whispered something to Gerald and turned away. 15 years since our divorce, and she still couldn't acknowledge me without discomfort. I wondered, not for the first time, what she had told Vanessa about our marriage and its end. Taking my seat, I nodded politely to those around me, an elderly couple who introduced themselves as friends of Bradley's grandparents, and a younger woman who mentioned being Vanessa's former college roommate. They seemed surprised to learn I was the father of the bride, which told me everything about how Vanessa had positioned me in her life narrative. The ceremony began precisely at 2 p.m. String quartet music filled the air as the wedding party processed in, groomsmen in black tuxedos, bridesmaids in pale gold gowns that caught the light with each step. Bradley entered with his parents, looking nervous but happy. He was handsome in a conventional way, with the confident bearing of someone who had never worried about money or status. Then came the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading. The music swelled, and the guests rose as Vanessa appeared at the entrance, her arm linked with Gerald. My heart clenched at the sight of my daughter, so beautiful in her white gown, her face partially obscured by a delicate veil. Gerald, not me, would be the one to walk her down the aisle, to give her away, to have that precious moment I had imagined since she was born.
Nothing is too much trouble. She glanced around the opulent ballroom. Well, it's quite the event, isn't it? Bradley's parents insisted on the best of everything. The Grand Horizon, top-shelf everything, the works. It's beautiful, I agreed. You deserve a perfect day. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Bradley's father is in commercial real estate. His company owns half the luxury developments downtown. and his mother's family practically built this city. I recognized what she was doing, drawing comparisons, highlighting the gap between her new family's status and what she perceived as my modest means. It was painful to hear, but I kept my expression neutral. They sound impressive. They are. She took another sip of champagne. Gerald's firm is handling some of their international contracts now. It's a whole different world from how I grew up. One of Bradley's cousins at our table, perhaps sensing the uncomfortable direction of the conversation, attempted to change the subject. The food was incredible. That sea bass was cooked to perfection. Thank you, Vanessa replied, seizing the new topic. We used Lysyric's catering. Their executive chef trained in Paris. Bradley's parents are close friends with the owner. It took considerable effort not to mention that I was, in fact, the majority investor in Lysyric, having purchased it 3 years earlier when it was on the verge of bankruptcy. Instead, I simply nodded appreciatively. The cake should be coming out soon, Vanessa continued. It's a custom design by Amélie Dubois. Again, I held my tongue. Amélie was a talented baker who had approached me for startup funding last year. Her patisserie was one of my smaller investments, but one I was particularly proud of. As if on cue, the lights dimmed slightly, and the MC announced it was time for the cake cutting. Vanessa excused herself from our table, casting one last glance at me. "It was good of you to come, Dad," she said, her tone suggesting she was doing me a favor by acknowledging me, "even if you don't really fit in with all this." The words stung, but I smiled through it. "I'm just happy to see you happy, Vanessa." She hesitated for a moment, something flickering in her eyes that might have been guilt or even a hint of the affection we once shared. But then Bradley appeared at her side, whisking her away to the center of the room where a magnificent multi-tiered cake awaited them. I remained at the table, finishing my drink as I watched the traditional cake cutting, followed by more dancing and celebrating. The party showed no signs of slowing down, and no one at table 19 seemed inclined to leave early. I was effectively trapped in my assigned corner, watching my daughter's new life unfold at a distance. It was during one of the band's breaks, when recorded music played over the speakers, that everything changed. I had stepped away from the table to get some air, finding a quiet spot near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights stretched out below, a tapestry of twinkling diamonds against the darkness. "Mr. Reynolds?" I turned to find Bradley's father, William Wellington, extending his hand. We had been briefly introduced in the receiving line, but hadn't spoken since. "Mr. Wellington," I nodded, shaking his hand. "Congratulations! It's a beautiful wedding." "Please call me Bill," he smiled, the easy confidence of wealth evident in his bearing. "And thank you, though I can't take much credit. The women handled most of the planning." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, both looking out at the view. He finally said, "I understand you work in maintenance." "That's right," I replied, curious where this was going. "Honest work," he nodded approvingly. "My father started as a carpenter before he built his first apartment complex. Always told me to respect people who work with their hands." This wasn't the direction I had expected the conversation to take. Wise man. "Vanessa doesn't talk about you much," Bill said, continuing, his directness surprising me. "But when she does, there's always this defensiveness, like she's anticipating criticism that isn't there." I chose my words carefully. "Vanessa and I have had a complicated relationship since the divorce. She went to live with her mother, and perspectives get shaped." Bill nodded thoughtfully. "My son is crazy about your daughter, you know. Says she's the smartest, most ambitious woman he's ever met. But sometimes I worry." "About what?" I asked when he didn't continue. He sighed. "About the image being more important than the substance. Bradley was raised with money, but we tried to teach him values, work ethic, integrity. The things that matter when the fancy cars and big houses are gone. I found myself warming to this man who, despite his wealth, seemed to share some of my fundamental values. I've always believed character is built through effort and overcoming challenges, I said. Maybe that's old-fashioned. If it is, then I'm old-fashioned too, Bill chuckled. Listen, we should have you over for dinner sometime. Get to know the other grandfather of our future grandchildren. The thought of grandchildren, of being allowed to be part of their lives in a way I hadn't been permitted with Vanessa, created a lump in my throat. I'd like that, I managed to say. Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the head table. Raised voices cut through the music, drawing everyone's attention. To my horror, I realized it was Vanessa and her mother, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument. "You promised, Mom," Vanessa's voice carried across the now quieting room. "You said you and Gerald would cover the Maldives portion." Claire's response was too low to hear, but her tight expression and defensive posture told the story. Beside her, Gerald looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room as guests began to stare. "Is everything okay?" Dill murmured, concern etching his features. "I'm not sure," I replied, already moving toward the unfolding scene. As I approached, I could hear more of the exchange. "The honeymoon was your responsibility," Vanessa was saying, her cheeks flushed with emotion and alcohol. "You know we stretched ourselves thin with the down payment on the condo." "Darling, this isn't the time or place," Claire hissed, attempting to guide Vanessa away from listening ears. "We'll discuss this tomorrow." "No!" Vanessa pulled away from her mother's grasp. "You always do this, make big promises and then back out at the last minute. Just like when you promised to pay for grad school and then forgot until I had to take out loans." By now, Bradley had joined them, trying to calm his new wife. "Babe, it's okay. We can figure it out. Let's not do this now." But Vanessa was past the point of discretion, years of resentment apparently boiling over. "It's not okay. Do you know how embarrassing it is? Everyone here thinks we have this perfect, wealthy family, and it's all a lie. Mom and Gerald are drowning in debt trying to keep up appearances, and my real dad is—" She broke off as she spotted me standing nearby, her eyes widening slightly before narrowing in what looked like anger. "My real dad is a nobody who fixes toilets for a living, living in the same shabby house in the same middle-class neighborhood, driving the same beat-up truck for 20 years because he has no ambition, no concept of what it means to really succeed." The room had gone completely silent. Even the band had stopped playing, leaving Vanessa's words to hang in the air unchallenged. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "I think you've had enough champagne. Let's go somewhere private and talk." "Talk about what?" She laughed bitterly. "About how you could have given me more but chose not to? About how pathetic it is to have no goals beyond a supervisor position at a factory? God, Dad, do you have any idea how it feels to have friends over in high school and have to explain why my father lives like that?" Each word felt like a physical blow, but I maintained my composure. This wasn't really about me. It was about her own insecurities, her own misplaced values. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said evenly, "but this is hardly the time to air family grievances. You have guests." "Don't tell me what to do at my own wedding," she snapped. "A wedding you contributed nothing to, by the way. Bradley's parents paid for most of it, and Mom and Gerald covered the rest. What did you bring besides your embarrassing presents? A toaster from Target?" The grand ballroom fell silent. You could hear a champagne flute drop. Every eye was on us, the supposedly pathetic maintenance worker being publicly humiliated by his daughter on her wedding day. Bradley looked mortified, his parents shocked. Claire was frantically trying to quiet Vanessa, who was now swaying slightly on her feet, face flushed with emotion and alcohol. I took a slow, deep breath and straightened my shoulders. For 20 years, I had maintained my secret. For 20 years, I had allowed my daughter to believe I was exactly what I appeared to be. It had been a principle, a lesson in values I had hoped she would eventually understand. But standing there, seeing the disdain in her eyes, the embarrassment on her face at claiming me as her father, I realized that the lesson had failed. Instead of teaching her about character and substance, I had simply given her a reason to resent me. Perhaps it was time for the truth. Not for revenge, not to humiliate her in return, but because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is remove the comfortable lies that allow someone to avoid confronting their own character. "I didn't bring a toaster from Target," I said quietly, my voice somehow carrying through the silent room. "I brought something else, something I've been waiting for you to be ready for." Vanessa rolled her eyes, the gesture so reminiscent of her teenage years that it almost made me smile despite everything. "What, Dad? Life advice? Another lecture about honest work and simple living? No thanks." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I accessed the banking app that only a handful of people knew existed. I handed the phone to her. "Here's my wedding gift to you and Bradley, something I've been saving for the right moment." Confusion replaced anger as she took the phone, looking down at the screen. I watched her expression change, confusion to disbelief, disbelief to shock. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again as she stared at the account balance displayed on the screen. This can't be right," she whispered. $35 million? This is some kind of joke." "It's no joke," I replied evenly. "That's just one of my accounts, the liquid assets. It doesn't include the business holdings, the real estate portfolio, or the foundation endowment." Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide with incomprehension. "But you're a maintenance supervisor at the factory. You've always been—" "I own the factory," I said simply, "and 16 others across 3 continents. Reynolds Industrial Solutions. Perhaps you've heard of it." A gasp went up from several guests. Reynolds Industrial was well known in business circles, a privately held conglomerate that had been quietly acquiring underperforming manufacturing facilities, modernizing them, and turning them into industry leaders in sustainable practices. The mysterious CEO was rarely seen in public, preferring to work through proxies and representatives. That's not possible," Vanessa stammered, her composure completely shattered. "You drive a 10-year-old truck. You live in that little house. You wear work clothes and shop at discount stores." "Yes, I do. By choice, not necessity." Bradley had moved to Vanessa's side, staring at the phone screen in equal disbelief. "Sir, are you saying you're Thomas Reynolds? The Thomas Reynolds?" "I am," I confirmed. "But why?" Vanessa's voice cracked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Why would you pretend to be nobody when you're this?" The pain in her question cut through my resolve. I had never meant to hurt her, only to protect her from the corrupting influence of unearned wealth. Had I gone too far in the other direction? "I never pretended to be nobody, Vanessa," I said gently. "I've always been exactly who I am, a man who believes character is built through effort, not handed out with trust funds. A man who wants to be valued for who he is, not what he owns." I glanced around the room, taking in the stunned faces of the guests before returning my gaze to my daughter. "When your mother and I divorced, I gave her the settlement she wanted. I could have given more, but I knew even then that money without purpose can do more harm than good. I wanted you to learn the value of work, of earning your own way, of finding satisfaction in achievement rather than acquisition. So you let me struggle?" Tears were now flowing freely down Vanessa's cheeks, leaving trails in her perfect makeup. "You watched me work 2 jobs in college, take out loans, pinch pennies for years while you had this?" "I watched you grow stronger with every challenge," I corrected her. "I saw you develop resilience, determination, and skills that can never be taken from you. I owe everyone an apology, especially my father. I've been horrible, shallow, obsessed with appearances and status when I should have been paying attention to what really matters." The raw honesty in her voice caught me off guard.
This was not the reaction I had expected. Not anger at my deception, not demands for financial compensation, but genuine self-reflection. "You don't have to do this now," I said quietly. "We can talk later, when things are calmer." "No, Dad," she shook her head. "I've spent too long caring what people think instead of what's true. And the truth is, I've been ashamed of you because I didn't understand you. I thought your simple life was a failure when it was actually a choice, a brave one, that I was too superficial to appreciate." Bradley squeezed her hand supportively. "Babe, it's okay. We all make mistakes." She gave him a watery smile before turning back to me. "Dad, I don't know where we go from here. I don't know how to process all this, but I do know I've been wrong about what matters, and I want to understand why you made the choices you did. It was more than I had hoped for. Not instant reconciliation or forgiveness, but an openness to understanding, a willingness to question her own values rather than simply judge mine. It was, perhaps, the first step toward the relationship I had always wanted with my daughter, one based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence." "I'd like that," I said simply. William Wellington, proving himself once again to be a man of admirable social grace, raised his voice to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, while this has been an unexpected turn of events, it's also a powerful reminder of what truly matters in life and in family. I propose a toast to honesty, to values that transcend wealth, and to new beginnings." Glasses were raised around the room, guests seemingly relieved to have a socially acceptable way to respond to the scene they had just witnessed. The band took this as a cue to increase their volume further, and soon, couples were venturing back onto the dance floor, the rhythm of the celebration gradually resuming. In the momentary respite, I turned to William and offered my hand. "Thank you for that. You handled an awkward situation with remarkable poise." He shook my hand firmly. "I meant what I said about admiring your principles, Thomas. Not many men with your resources would choose the path you did. Fewer still would stick to it for decades." "It hasn't always been easy," I admitted, "especially watching Vanessa struggle with things I could have easily fixed. As a father myself, I understand. We want to smooth the path for our children, but sometimes the rough patches are what shape them into the people they need to become." I glanced over to where Vanessa stood, with Bradley, both of them still processing the revelation. "I hope I haven't ruined their day," I said quietly. "That was never my intention." "Days like these have a way of becoming the stories families tell for generations," William replied, thoughtfully. "This wedding won't be forgotten, that's certain. But whether it's remembered with resentment or as a turning point towards something better, that's still being written." He was right, of course. The evening could still go in any number of directions. Vanessa might reflect on her behavior and our relationship, or the shock might give way to anger at what she might perceive as years of deception. Claire and Gerald might attempt to salvage their image, or accept that the facade had crumbled. The Wellington family might reconsider their son's choice of bride given the dramatic scene they had just witnessed. But as I watched Vanessa whisper something to Bradley before they both looked in my direction, I felt a cautious hope that perhaps the truth, however painfully delivered, might finally clear the path for the authentic relationship I had always wanted with my daughter. "Mr. Reynolds," Bradley approached, his composure mostly restored. "Vanessa and I were wondering if, that is, would you join us for the next dance?" The question caught me by surprise. It was a small gesture, but a significant one.
an invitation back into the circle from which I had been so deliberately excluded. "I'd be honored," I replied, my voice rougher than I intended. As we moved to the dance floor, I noticed Claire watching us, her expression unreadable. Gerald stood beside her, speaking quietly into her ear. Whatever narrative they were constructing to explain this turn of events, I hoped it would be one that allowed Vanessa some peace.
"If you need to talk about that, my door is open," I offered. Not out of obligation to Claire, but out of concern for how their financial stability might affect Vanessa. She gave me a tight smile that acknowledged both the generosity and the implicit criticism in my offer. "Always practical, Thomas. Some things never change." "The important things rarely do," I agreed. The photographer positioned us against a backdrop of the city skyline, visible through the terrace doors. Night had fallen completely now, the city lights twinkling like earthbound stars. It was a fitting metaphor for the evening. Darkness revealing new perspectives, hidden truths suddenly illuminated. "Closer together, please," the photographer instructed, gesturing for me to move in beside Vanessa and Bradley. "Mr. Reynolds, if you could put your arm around your daughter's shoulder." I hesitated, uncertain if such familiarity would be welcome after everything that had transpired. But Vanessa nodded almost imperceptibly, and I gently placed my arm around her shoulders. She stiffened momentarily, then relaxed into the pose. "Perfect," the photographer declared, snapping a series of photos. "Now one with the bride's parents together." Claire moved to stand beside me, a careful distance between us that spoke volumes about our history. We smiled as directed, two people who had once shared everything, now connected only by the young woman standing between us. After the photos were complete, Bradley's parents suggested we all get some fresh air on the terrace. It was a tactful move, giving our family some privacy while still maintaining the appearance of a unified celebration. The night air was cool but not unpleasant, carrying the scent of the carefully maintained gardens below. "So," William Wellington began conversationally, "I understand you're in manufacturing, Thomas. Reynolds Industrial Solutions has quite a reputation for revitalizing struggling factories." "That's been our focus, yes," I replied, grateful for the neutral topic. "Taking facilities with good bones but outdated processes and bringing them into the modern era, with an emphasis on sustainability and fair labor practices." "Admirable," Margaret Wellington, Bradley's mother, commented. "So many in your position would simply offshore everything to maximize profits." "Profit matters," I acknowledged, "but so does purpose. Every community where we operate becomes stronger. Better jobs, environmental improvements, educational opportunities. That's a different kind of return on investment, but one I value highly." I was conscious of Vanessa listening intently, absorbing this side of me she had never known. Her expression was thoughtful, processing not just the revelation of my wealth, but the philosophy behind it. The Reynolds Foundation. That's why it sounded familiar. They funded the new science center at my high school, and the scholarship program at university. I nodded. Among other initiatives. We try to be discreet about the source of the funding. It's about the impact, not the recognition. All this time, I thought you were just existing. Going through the motions in that little house with that old truck. I never imagined you were building something so significant. I never talked about it. Perhaps that was a mistake. But I wanted our relationship to be based on something more fundamental than financial success. Bradley, who had been quietly supportive throughout, finally spoke up. "Sir, if I may ask, what happens now, with the business, the foundation, all of it?" It was a fair question, one that looked beyond the immediate emotional turmoil to practical considerations. I appreciated his pragmatism. "That depends partly on Vanessa," I replied honestly. "I've always intended for her to inherit eventually, but only if she wanted the responsibility. It's a stewardship as much as an ownership." Vanessa's eyes widened. "You'd trust me with that? After how I've treated you?" "Family relationships are complex. We've both made mistakes. But I've never doubted your intelligence, your capability, or your potential to grow beyond the values Claire and I inadvertently instilled in you?" William nodded approvingly. "Wise perspective. The true test of parenting isn't how our children behave at 25, but who they become over a lifetime of choices." Claire, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. "Vanessa has always been determined, stubborn even. Gets that from both of us, I suppose." She glanced at me with what might have been the ghost of affection.
"She'll figure it out, now that she has all the information." It was the closest thing to a peace offering Claire had extended in 15 years, and I accepted it with a nod of acknowledgement. The band inside struck up a lively tune, drawing our attention back to the celebration continuing without us. Guests were dancing energetically, many probably unaware of the family drama that had unfolded earlier, or politely pretending ignorance. "We should rejoin the party," Margaret suggested tactfully. "It is a wedding, after all." Bradley offered his arm to Vanessa. "What do you say, Mrs. Wellington? Ready to celebrate properly?" The gentle question seemed to ground Vanessa, reminding her of the primary purpose of the day. She took a deep breath, visibly collecting herself, and nodded. "Yes. Whatever happens next with all of this, today is still our day." As the others moved toward the ballroom, Vanessa hesitated, then turned back to me. "Dad, would you save me a dance? A proper father-daughter dance?" The question caught in my throat like a physical thing. This simple request, the one thing I had wanted most from this day, offered now as a tentative olive branch. "I would like that very much," I managed to say. Back in the ballroom, the celebration had found its rhythm again. If there were whispers about what had transpired earlier, they were masked by music and laughter. I found myself approached by several guests who suddenly seemed eager to make my acquaintance, a phenomenon I had observed countless times when people discovered someone in their midst had significant wealth. I handled these interactions politely but briefly, having no interest in connections based on dollar signs rather than genuine interest. More meaningful were the conversations with a few of Vanessa's longtime friends who approached with sincere curiosity about the man their friend had so rarely mentioned. To these, I spoke openly about my work, my values, and my hope for reconciliation with my daughter. "She's been through a lot," one friend, Emily, told me confidentially. "The divorce was harder on her than she lets on. And there was always this competition, I guess, with her stepfather's family, with her wealthier friends, like she felt she had to prove herself constantly." "I never wanted that for her," I said quietly. Emily nodded understanding. "I know. I could always tell there was more to the story than she admitted. Vanessa has a good heart under all that status anxiety, and she talks about you more than you probably realize. Not always kindly, but always like your opinion matters, even when she claims it doesn't." This small insight into my daughter's perspective was perhaps the most valuable gift I received that day. It offered hope that beneath the layers of resentment and misunderstanding, there remained a foundation upon which we might rebuild. As promised, Vanessa found me later in the evening. The band had been playing slower numbers, the energy of the reception shifting as the night progressed. She approached somewhat tentatively, the confidence she had displayed earlier tempered now by reflection. "Dad, is that dance still on offer?" I set down my drink and stood. "Absolutely." We moved to the dance floor just as the band began a new song, a gentle ballad about time and perspective that seemed almost too appropriate for the moment. As we began to dance, I was conscious of eyes upon us, but for once, neither of us seemed to care about the perceptions of others. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about measuring love in respect rather than dollars. It's how my father taught me. He didn't have much in the terms of material wealth, but he gave me something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, of responsibility to something beyond myself." "My grandfather," she murmured, as if suddenly remembering the man she had barely known. You never talk about him. He died before you were old enough to remember him properly, I explained. But he was the foundation of everything I built later. A factory worker who read philosophy books on his lunch break and believed that a person's worth had nothing to do with their bank balance. We moved in silence for a moment, the music filling the space between words. I've been so focused on appearances, Vanessa finally said. On what others think, on status and recognition. I forgot to ask myself what actually matters to me. Not to Mom, not to my friends, not to society at large. It was a profound self-realization, one that many people never achieve regardless of age or circumstance. I felt a surge of pride that despite everything, my daughter possessed the capacity for such honest self-reflection. That's the most important question anyone can ask themselves, I said. And the answer often changes throughout life. The key is to keep asking, to never accept external definitions of success without examining them. She nodded thoughtfully. I'm not sure I know the answer yet, but I think I'd like to learn more about the foundation, about what you've built. Not because of the money, but because it seems meaningful. It was more than I had dared to hope for. Not just reconciliation, but genuine interest in the purpose behind my work. I understand that now, she said, her voice reflective. Or, I'm beginning to. It's like I've been living in a house made entirely of windows, always worried about who might be looking in, never able to just be. It was an apt metaphor, revealing a depth of self-awareness that made me prouder than any academic or career achievement ever could have. True to their word, Vanessa and Bradley met with Michael, my financial advisor. They came prepared not with demands or expectations, but with questions, with a genuine desire to understand how money worked, how it could serve their goals rather than defining them. They're quick studies, Michael told me afterward. Once they understood the principles, they developed their own plan for eliminating their debt and building toward meaningful goals. Bradley's particularly interested in sustainable investing. Reminds me of you in the early days. Over the following months, our relationship continued to evolve. Vanessa began to take an interest in the foundation, first attending board meetings as an observer, then gradually contributing ideas for new initiatives. She had a particular passion for educational equity, for creating pathways for talented young people, regardless of their economic background. I think I finally understand why you lived the way you did, she told me one evening as we reviewed grant proposals together. It wasn't about denying yourself luxury or proving some moral point. It was about freedom. The freedom to define success on your own terms, to build something meaningful without being constrained by others' expectations. That's exactly it, I nodded, pleased that she had articulated something I had felt but never quite expressed so succinctly. Money is just a tool that amplifies who we already are. If we don't know who that is beyond our bank balance, we're building on sand. She considered this thoughtfully. I'm still figuring that out, who I am beyond all the external markers I've relied on. It's harder than I expected. It's the work of a lifetime, I assured her, and it's the most important work we do. A year after the wedding, Vanessa and Bradley invited me to dinner at their condo. They'd redecorated since I'd last visited, the previous ostentatious styling replaced by something warmer, more personal, reflecting their evolving values rather than design magazine ideals. Over dessert, they shared their news. They were expecting their first child, my first grandchild. As Vanessa described their hopes and plans,
I saw in her eyes something I had longed for throughout her childhood and young adulthood. Not perfection or achievement, but purpose, a sense of meaning that transcended material considerations. "We want to raise them with values," she said, instinctively resting her hand on her still flat stomach. "To understand that what matters isn't what you have, but who you are and how you use whatever advantages you've been given." "That sounds familiar," I smiled. "I had a good teacher," she replied, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand, even when I was too stubborn to recognize it. Later, as I drove home in my still practical truck, though I had finally replaced the 10-year-old model with a newer, more fuel-efficient version, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. From the painful exclusion at the wedding to this moment of genuine connection, the path had been neither straight nor easy. There had been difficult conversations, moments of backsliding, the occasional resurgence of old patterns and resentments. But through it all, we had persevered, held together by something stronger than wealth or status or appearances, the enduring bond between parent and child, the shared desire to understand and be understood, to love and be loved for who we truly are, rather than what we possess. As I pulled into my driveway, I glanced at my modest home, the home Vanessa had once been embarrassed by, now the place where she often sought refuge from the noise and pressure of a world too focused on external metrics of success. I thought of my father, of the wisdom he had passed down that had guided my choices even when they seemed incomprehensible to others.
And I felt profound gratitude that I would have the chance to be that kind of grandfather, one who teaches not through lectures or even example alone, but through love that values character over credentials, purpose over possessions, authenticity over appearance. In the end, my fortune had not been the $35 million that shocked the wedding guests into silence. The true fortune had been the opportunity to pass on something far more valuable, the understanding that real wealth lies not in what we own, but in who we become and the legacy of values we leave behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.